There is a photograph taken sometime in the late summer of 1971 on the deck of a research vessel anchored off the northeastern shore of Isle Royale. The man in the photograph is seated on an equipment crate, still in his dry suit, the hood pushed back from his face. He is not looking at the camera, he is looking at the water. His name was Gerald Mossner, and he had just come up from 312 feet below the surface of Lake Superior. He would dive that reef one more time before the season ended. After that, the dive site was administratively closed, the coordinates removed from the public survey log, and the channel leading to it marked on updated navigation charts as a restricted area pending hazard assessment. Mossner died in 1989 at a veterans hospital in Duluth. His dive logs from the Isle Royale surveys of 1971 were not included in the materials his family received. The National Park Service has no record of their location. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Isle Royale sits in the northwestern corner of Lake Superior, 45 miles from the Minnesota shore and 15 miles from Ontario. It became a national park in 1940, though the federal government had been acquiring land there since the 1880s, largely to control copper extraction rights. The island was mined extensively through the mid-19th century. The Minong Mine, the Siskowit Mine, the Island Mine, these were working pits that pulled native copper from ancient fissures, copper that had been extracted by indigenous people for thousands of years before European contact, and that drew American commercial interest the moment the region opened to treaty exploitation. By the 1890s, most of the island's surface mines had played out. The accessible ore was gone, or too deep to reach at a profit. The operations closed, the workers left, and the island began its long return to forest and silence. What stayed, and what the Park Service inherited when it absorbed the island, was the physical record of that extraction. Collapsed headframes, tailing piles, the ruins of stamp mills and engine houses built from the island's own stone and now returning to it. And below the waterline, where the old pits had been sunk toward the lake's edge or directly into the shoreline bluffs, there were shafts and adits that had flooded when the pumps stopped. Nobody catalogued them systematically. They were not on the operational maps the Park Service used for its land management work. They were simply there, as the island itself was there, present and unmapped, waiting in the cold and the dark, below the level at which swimmers surface and boats draw water. Gerald Mossner came to Isle Royale through the University of Minnesota's limnology program. He had trained as a hard-hat diver during his military service in the late 1950s and transitioned to scuba when the equipment became reliable enough for sustained scientific work in the early 1960s. By the time he joined the Isle Royale survey team in 1969, he had logged more cold water dives than almost anyone working in freshwater research in the upper Midwest. Lake Superior is not a forgiving environment. The thermocline drops the temperature below the first 40 feet to just above freezing year-round, regardless of the season or the surface conditions. Visibility, which can reach 60 feet in summer above the thermocline, closes to between 15 and 20 feet below it, and to nothing in the silt-laden water near old mine workings or disturbed lake-bottom sediment. The lake is deep enough in its central basin that standard scuba equipment becomes physiologically unreliable before you reach the bottom in most of the water surrounding the island. Mossner's dry suit and his training in military mixed gas diving, and his documented tolerance for extended bottom time in cold water, made him the program's primary deep surveyor when the work required going beyond what recreational equipment and conventional dive tables would support. The survey work was nominally about the submerged mining infrastructure. The Park Service wanted to know what was down there beneath the shoreline and along the underwater extensions of the old workings, whether any of the flooded shafts posed navigation hazards to the commercial and pleasure traffic that moved through the island's channels, whether there were environmental concerns from the abandoned operations, chemical contamination, structural instability in the underwater portions of old drifts that could affect the shoreline above, whether any of it was historically significant in a way that warranted formal documentation and potential preservation designation. Mossner dove the shafts off Tobin Harbour and along the Blake Point approaches in 1969 and 1970. He documented what he found with underwater photography using a housing adapted for the low-light conditions below the thermocline and written logs that he submitted to the survey coordinator at the end of each season. Those logs, through 1970, are held in partial form at the Park Service Archive in Houghton. The entries are procedural and careful. Depths, visibility conditions, observations about structural integrity of old timber framing, notes on sediment layers, and biological growth rates. They are the records of a thorough working diver who had no reason, in those 2 seasons, to think he was looking at anything other than what the survey mandate described. The 1971 season was different in its objectives from the outset. Mossner came back to Isle Royale in June of that year with a specific target. During his dives the previous 2 seasons, he had been tracking what he described in his notes as an anomalous current pattern along the northeastern reef complex, a formation that did not fall within the primary scope of the flooded shaft survey, but that he had flagged in his end-of-season reports as warranting further investigation. The reef in question extends from the island's northeastern shore in a series of submerged ridges that drop steadily from 30 feet at the inner edge to well over 200 feet at the outer wall, where the rock formation ends and the lake bottom drops away into the deep basin. It is not a reef in the tropical sense. No coral, no warm water biology, no living reef structure of the kind that grows in shallow salt water. What the word names here is a series of submerged stone formations, ancient volcanic basalt capped with conglomerate, that creates a defined underwater topography significant enough to shape the currents moving across that section of the lake. Divers who have worked the area in recreational capacities know the shallower portions for their wreck artifacts, bits of old ships that came to grief on the outer rocks in the days before reliable navigation charts covered that section of the lake. Below 150 feet, recreational divers do not go. The equipment requirements and the decompression obligations put that depth category beyond all but a few working operations with the funding and the planning to support technical diving. The current pattern Mossner had noted did not match the bathymetric models for the area. Water moves through Superior in largely predictable ways given the thermal layering and the prevailing wind patterns across the lake's surface and the geological shape of the basin. What Mossner was measuring, through a series of dye traces released at varying depths and current meters he deployed from the survey vessel, suggested an outflow from somewhere inside the reef structure itself, not a circulation pattern generated by the reef's exterior shape, deflecting the lake's normal flow, but something passing through the rock from one side to the other. He was not, at this point in his documentation, theorizing about what caused it. He was recording what he measured, which was the discipline his training had given him, and he was planning dives that would let him locate the source. His first deep dive of the 71 season reached 230 feet along the outer wall of the reef, in a section he had selected based on the surface current measurements as a likely zone for the outflow source. He described the wall in his log entry for that dive as consistent with the geological character of the earlier surveys, a basalt face, heavy sedimentation in the horizontal ledge recesses, minimal biological activity below 180 feet, where the light reaching from the surface becomes too attenuated to support even the low-energy organisms that colonize the shallower sections. No anomalies in the wall structure. The current signature he had detected from the surface was present at that depth, measurable on his instruments, but he could not locate its source from that position on the wall. He came up on schedule, ran his decompression stops, and logged the dive without conclusions. He scheduled a second dive for 3 days later, targeting a section of the outer wall 200 yards north of the first entry point, where the bathymetric survey data suggested a structural irregularity in the rock face that might account for the current pattern. The log entry for that second dive is the last entry in the materials held at Houghton. The entry records the dive to a maximum depth of 260 feet. It records visibility at approximately 25 feet at that depth, which is better than average for the outer wall in the summer season, and which Mossner noted as indicating low particulate disturbance in the water column that day. It records the presence of what Mossner described as an opening in the basalt face at 251 feet, oriented roughly northwest into the reef structure, with a cross-section he estimated at 12 feet wide and 8 feet high at the center of the arch. The current he had been tracking from the surface through the preceding weeks of instrument work was moving through this opening, outward into the lake. The water passing through the opening was, by his thermometer reading, 2 degrees warmer than the ambient lake water at that depth. The log entry ends at this point. There is no closing notation indicating ascent, no surface interval entry, no equipment check record. The entry simply stops at the description of the opening and the temperature reading, mid-observation, as though the hand writing it was interrupted. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What happened between that dive and the photograph on the deck of the research vessel is reconstructed from 3 sources: a partial account given by Mossner's surface tender, a man named Raymond Holst, to a journalist in 1993. A letter Mossner wrote to his sister in August of 1971, approximately 2 weeks after the dive, and the deposition of Dr. Ann Vara, who was the survey team's principal investigator and who was present on the vessel when Mossner surfaced that afternoon. Holst told the journalist, in an interview conducted for a regional outdoor magazine that assembled the piece but ultimately did not run it, that Mossner's ascent from the second deep dive took considerably longer than the planned decompression schedule required. The scheduled dive was structured to run 40 minutes at depth, with a controlled ascent and staged decompression stops at 60 feet and again at 30 feet, the total in-water time from descent to surface not to exceed approximately 90 minutes under the gas supply he carried. Mossner was at the surface after approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes in the water. Holst, monitoring from the vessel with a watch and the surface line, had been concerned enough at the 2-hour mark to prepare the emergency oxygen system. When Mossner surfaced, Holst reported that he appeared calm, physically intact, and showed no signs of acute decompression sickness or nitrogen narcosis. He assisted Mossner out of the water and onto the deck. Mossner asked what time it was. He looked at the water for a sustained period without speaking. He declined the hot drink Holst offered. He did not write in his dive log that afternoon, which Holst noted because in the 2 previous seasons he had never seen Mossner surface from a dive without logging it before he changed out of his suit. Vara's deposition, given in connection with a 1997 internal review of the survey program's documentation and archival practices, states that Mossner reported to her the following morning that he had entered the opening in the basalt face and proceeded through a passage that extended approximately 40 feet into the rock before the passage opened into a larger enclosed space. She states that Mossner told her the space was too dark to photograph adequately with the lighting equipment he had carried on that dive, which was configured for the open water wall work rather than for penetration diving into an enclosed formation. She states that he described the walls of the passage as showing evidence of tool working, by which he meant surfaces that appeared to have been cut rather than fractured, with what appeared to him to be regular spacing in the cut marks inconsistent with the random fracture patterns produced by geological stress or by the drilling and blasting techniques used in the old mining operations. She states that when she asked him to clarify what he meant by tool working, he said the stone looked dressed. That was the word he used, she confirmed. Dressed, as in stone that had been worked to a flat and regular surface by deliberate human labor. Vara told the review panel that she had reported Mossner's account to the Park Service liaison assigned to the survey program in a conversation she estimated had taken place within the week following the dive. She could not recall the liaison's name with certainty. She believed his first name was Thomas. She did not receive a written response to the report, and she did not follow up on it because, in her account, the remainder of the 71 season proceeded with its other survey objectives, and she understood the information had been passed to whatever reviewing body the Park Service deemed appropriate. She stated that she had not anticipated the dive materials from that season would be separated from the archive upon transfer to Marquette, and expressed surprise during the deposition when she was informed the materials were not located there. Mossner's letter to his sister, a woman named Patricia Mossner Lindquist, who was living in Two Harbors at the time and who worked as a schoolteacher there, survives because Lindquist kept it in a cedar chest with other family correspondence. She provided a copy to a researcher named Carl Bjornstad in 2004, when Bjornstad was assembling primary materials for a monograph on the survey program's history and reach. The monograph was not completed. Bjornstad died in 2007 from cardiac causes. The copy of the letter is held by Lindquist's daughter, who confirmed its existence to two separate researchers between 2010 and 2018, but has not made the document generally available, citing her mother's wishes about the material. What Lindquist told Bjornstad about the letter's contents, in notes he made by hand during their conversation that his estate subsequently made available to researchers, is this: Mossner wrote to his sister that he had found something below the reef that he did not have a good way to explain, and that he was not ready to write about it formally because he did not yet understand what he had seen well enough to describe it in the terms his work required. He used the same word he had used with Vara, dressed. He wrote that the passage through the rock was not a natural formation in any sense he could account for using his knowledge of the geology of the region. He wrote that the stone had been worked. He wrote that when he was inside the passage, at the point where it opened into the larger space, he had seen something on the floor of that space that he could not identify from his position and with the available light. He described it as a regular form, a shape that had edges and angles where the floor of the space should, by geology, have produced only irregular rock. He wrote that the water temperature inside the space was measurably warmer than the lake outside the passage, consistently with his instrument reading at the opening. He wrote about a faint luminescence he had observed inside the space that he had initially attributed to bioluminescence from the bacterial mats that sometimes form in oxygen-depleted enclosed lake environments, but that on reflection he could not confidently assign to that source because the light, as he had perceived it, was too uniform and too distributed across the space to match the patchy growth patterns of biological films. He wrote that he intended to return with better lighting equipment and a camera housing capable of sustained performance at that depth and in those conditions, and that he wanted to go deeper into the space to understand what the form on the floor was. He told his sister not to mention it to anyone yet. He went back once more, 3 weeks after the second dive. The photograph on the deck of the research vessel is from that day. He is seated on the equipment crate. He is looking at the water. Nobody on the vessel that day, according to later accounts given by 2 of the crew members to regional researchers, spoke with him at any length about what he had found. He came up from this third dive after a time Holst could not recall with precision, but described as extended, similar to the second dive. He submitted no log entry for the third dive. Vara stated in her deposition that she had no written record of a third deep dive to that section of the reef wall in her own notes from the 71 season, though she acknowledged she could not rule out that the dive had occurred during a period when she was occupied with other survey work in a different section of the island's coast. By the following spring, the channel approach to the northeastern reef complex had been marked restricted on the navigation charts issued for that portion of Lake Superior. The restriction notice carried the standard designation for hazard assessment pending review. The designation carries no statutory expiration date and requires no public disclosure of the underlying technical determination that prompted it. The coordinates Mossner had used in his survey work to locate the deep wall section and the opening within it do not appear in any publicly accessible document from the survey program. The Park Service archive at Houghton holds his materials through the end of the 1970 season. The 1971 materials are listed in the archive's internal acquisition log as received and subsequently transferred to the Regional Administrative Office at Marquette for specialist review. The Marquette office has no record of receiving the transfer. There is no tracking entry for the materials between the Houghton acquisition log notation and the point at which the Marquette office would have acknowledged receipt. The gap in the custody record is not annotated. The restriction on the northeastern reef approach has not been lifted in the more than 50 years since it was imposed. The hazard assessment that would form the basis of any review determination has never been published in any publicly available channel. There is no record of a formal administrative finding that the restriction should remain in place beyond its original imposition, and no record in the public archive of any subsequent survey of the deep wall section having been conducted by any authorized body. The area has been restricted for half a century on the basis of a pending review that produced no documented output. Mossner continued with the university for 3 more years after the Isle Royale survey work ended. He did not return to the island in any professional or personal capacity that left a record. His published work from this period concerns sediment core analysis from the lake's western arm and thermal stratification patterns in the Keweenaw corridor, work with no apparent connection to the northeastern reef surveys. A colleague who shared laboratory space with him during this period, interviewed in 2011 for an unrelated oral history project on the history of freshwater science in the upper Midwest, said that Mossner had spoken once about Isle Royale in the context of a broader conversation about the limits of what the lake had been adequately mapped and surveyed. The colleague recalled that Mossner had said something to the effect that the old copper miners had found the edge of something in the rock and had not understood what they were standing beside. The colleague did not pursue the remark because the conversation moved on, and because he had no frame at that time for understanding what Mossner might have meant. He offered this recollection to the oral history interviewer 37 years after the fact, with appropriate uncertainty about the precision of his memory. Mossner left the university in 1974. He worked intermittently in commercial diving for several years, primarily on pipeline inspection work in the Gulf, and later on bridge inspection contracts in the Lake States. Health problems connected to his military service required him to reduce physical activity progressively through the late 1970s. He moved to Duluth sometime around 1980 and entered the Veterans Hospital system there for ongoing care. He remained in Duluth for the rest of his life. He did not write about the Isle Royale surveys in any form that survived him. He died in February of 1989. The attending nurse who worked his final weeks, a woman named Dorothy Saarinen, kept a personal journal through her years in the Veterans Hospital. Her family donated the journal to a local historical society in 2016, 15 years after her own death. The journal is not a clinical record. It is a private document of the kind nurses and other caregiving workers have always kept, recording the texture of the work that official charts cannot accommodate. The conversations that happen at 3 in the morning in a hospital ward when the shift is quiet and a patient cannot sleep and there is nothing left to perform for anyone. Saarinen wrote about Mossner on 4 separate occasions across the weeks she cared for him. She wrote that he was a private man who did not want pastoral attention and was uncomfortable with the social work protocols the hospital ran through its terminal care program. She wrote that he had talked with her on a few occasions during night shifts, in the way that dying people sometimes talk, when the person beside them is not trying to help them and not trying to record anything. In one of these conversations, which Saarinen recorded in her journal 2 days after it happened, Mossner told her that he wished someone had been in the water with him on the last dive to that section of the reef. She wrote that he was clear he was not talking about safety. He had been a careful diver, he told her, and careful about the limits his gas supply imposed. He was talking about witness. He said that when you see something and no one sees it beside you, the question of whether what you saw was real begins to work on you in ways you do not expect, and that it works on you over years in ways that are different from how it works on you in the days right after. He said he had been certain for a long time, and that certainty had worn thinner than he had expected it to, not because his memory of what he had seen was unclear, but because memory without corroboration is a kind of solitary confinement. He told her the name of the lake. He told her the name of the island. He described, in terms she recorded in the journal as including his words wherever she could retain them, a passage in the rock below the reef wall, the temperature of the water inside it, a space that opened beyond the passage, and a form on the floor of that space that he had been unable to get close enough to identify with certainty before his gas situation required him to turn back. He told her he had gone back to see it again, and that the second time he had gotten closer. He did not tell her what it was. The northeastern reef still extends from Isle Royale's shore in the same configuration that the bathymetric surveys of the 1960s recorded. The outer wall still drops through the depth range Mossner worked. The basalt still holds whatever it holds in the cold and the dark at 251 feet. The restriction on the approach channel is still current on the navigation charts. The coordinates Mossner recorded in his second dive log entry, the entry that stops mid-observation, are not in any accessible document. The transfer of the 71 survey materials from Houghton to Marquette left no retrievable trail. The review that justified the restriction has no published findings. The dive log ends where it ends. The archive shows a gap that has no annotation. The restriction remains on a pending review that is now older than most of the people who might request it be completed. And the man who went down past the last wall of that reef, into water 2 degrees warmer than the lake around it, and who saw something on the floor of a space cut into rock that predates the continent's memory, took the final clarity of what he saw with him into a February in Duluth, in a hospital ward where a nurse with a journal was the only instrument recording anything at all. The shaft is still sealed, the reef is still there, and the water above the opening in the basalt wall is as cold and as dark and as patient as it has been since the last glacier retreated and the lake settled into the basin it has occupied ever since, indifferent to what moves through the rock below it and indifferent to the men who go down to find out. There is a broader record worth examining alongside Mossner's account. The Park Service's acquisition of Isle Royale in 1940 was not simply a conservation transaction. The island's copper history had left behind legal complications centered on mineral rights sold separately from surface rights during the peak extraction period in the 1860s and 1870s. Several of those mineral right claims had been purchased by interests associated with the large copper mining consolidations of the late 19th century, consolidations that absorbed smaller independent operations and held the deep ground rights in administrative suspension long after practical extraction was possible. The Park Service acquisition effectively nationalized those claims without extinguishing the documentation supporting them. What this means in practical terms is that the legal record of what the island's ground was believed to contain, as understood by the mining interests that held rights through the early 20th century, is distributed across multiple state and federal archive systems and has never been consolidated into a single accessible collection. The Minong mine records at Michigan Technological University contain the anomalous entry from 1886, the 2-sentence notation about the northwest face of the 6th level drift and the plane of separation the recording engineer found inconsistent with the surrounding basalt. The entry has no follow-up. The drift record turns south at that point to pursue copper, but the United States Geological Survey conducted a series of mapping exercises in the region between 1902 and 1914, covering the copper-bearing formations across the Keweenaw Peninsula and the island extension. The Isle Royale sections of those surveys are held at the USGS archive in Denver. Researchers who have worked in that collection report that the section covering the northeastern extension of the island's geological formation, the section corresponding to the reef complex Mossner surveyed, is present in the archive as a folder with a cover sheet and no interior contents. The cover sheet is dated 1912. The folder carries a notation in pencil, in a hand the archive staff cannot attribute, reading held pending field verification. No field verification record exists in the adjacent holdings. A cover sheet without contents is not, by itself, evidence of anything beyond ordinary institutional disorder. Archives lose things. Materials get misfiled, separated from their folders, damaged by moisture, or the simple entropy of a filing system administered across decades by staff with varying degrees of care. The most probable explanation is a long-ago misfiling never corrected. This should be stated plainly. What makes the gap sit alongside the other gaps rather than outside them is the geographic correspondence. The northeastern extension of the island's geological formation, the section the 1912 survey covers without interior contents, is the same formation that produces the outer reef wall where Mossner identified the opening at 251 feet. The sixth-level drift at the Minong mine, where the 1886 log records the dressed plane anomaly before the entry turns south and the observation is never revisited, is on the same body of rock. The navigation restriction on the approach channel covers the same coordinates. These are not three separate administrative systems failing independently in three separate places across 8 decades. They are three separate systems producing the same kind of gap in the same location. That observation does not constitute a finding. It constitutes a pattern worth naming. A specific section of Isle Royale's subsurface geology has a documented history of producing observations noted once and not pursued, and of having its associated records absent from where they should be held. The pattern begins in 1886 with a mining engineer who noted something in the rock face and turned his drift south. It runs through 1912 with a survey folder holding nothing where its field documentation should be. It arrives in 1971 with a diver whose log stops mid-entry and whose materials transfer without arriving, and it ends with a navigation restriction pending review for longer than the span of a working lifetime. What the pattern cannot tell you is what is in the rock. The dressed plane anomaly in the Minong mine's sixth-level drift may have been a geological feature the engineer's terminology imprecisely described. The USGIS folder may have been emptied decades ago for mundane reasons. Mossner's log may have been lost in transit through ordinary administrative failure, and the form on the floor of the enclosed space at the end of the passage through the outer reef wall may have been a geological feature that Mossner mischaracterized in the dark at 260 feet. The possibility that all of this is coincidence and ordinary institutional disorder is real and should not be set aside. It should be held in one hand while the other holds what the record shows, a series of accounts from people who went into that section of the island's ground and rock and water and came back with observations they could not place inside the geological framework they carried going down. A mining engineer who noted something and turned away from it. A diver who found a passage in rock that was 2 degrees warmer than the lake around it, described its walls as dressed, saw a form he could not name, and spent the rest of his life certain of what he had seen and unable to demonstrate it to anyone. A nurse's journal that records the weight of a dying man's certainty and the specific shape of what he described at 3 in the morning when there was no professional reason left to keep anything back. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.